Well, tonight I'm going to preach a message. I don't know that I've ever preached it at any of the churches where I've ever pastored. I've kept up with every sermon I've ever preached, starting back to April 1st, 1978. I wrote it down, a message that I preached at a church, a youth Sunday at a church near Memphis, Tennessee, when I was a full-time teacher and coach and did voluntary youth work on the side. And about half my sermon, I've preached over 6,000 times, but now through a fresh start, and then a program we aired on WVLR in Knoxville called In Times Like These, when I pastored Central Baptist Church in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, about 3,000 times. I've preached via a program such as A Fresh Start or In Times Like These. We preachers have what we call sugar sticks. They're what we think are our best sermons. And I've had sermons I've preached, I don't know if I've preached any 100 times yet since I've been preaching full time since 1981, but I've gotten close. And there are several that I preach over and over again. If I go to a church one time or to preach a revival, whatever, a lot of times I'll preach these sermons, but I'm thankful here in recent months and now Lord's still giving me new sermons, and this is one that I don't believe I've ever preached at a church, but what a great passage. It's not that it's a great message by me. What a great message from the Bible. It's from the book of Esther. The book of Esther, and I'm not going to go into all the details of it, but it's a unique book in the Bible. Some people wondered why I say, well, it's there because God wanted it there, and it was part of how God worked through Esther and her uncle to help preserve the Jewish people up to this very day. The remnant, is the Christ line went through there. They were going to be destroyed, but God took care of them. And so there's a verse, it's just, I've heard this phrase many times, and perhaps you've heard someone say, well, for such a time as this, God has allowed this. Folks, what we've been through and what has been known as the COVID pandemic, God allowed it. I'm not going to get into all the theology of why did God do this, why He didn't do this, and so on. But God will get us through it, I can tell you that. He's gotten through people in the Bible, as you read through the Bible, through some difficult times and difficult days. And all I know is that whatever for such a time as this may be, I want to find out, what is God trying to teach me? What is God trying to show me? And I know this, we can trust God to get us through. And let me just kind of summarize. Let me read this verse first. What had happened is that the king, and it's unusual the way that it came about, but the king there at that time was looking for a new queen. So they had all these young maidens of all kinds fix themselves up for months, and they'd come before the king, and then he'd decide who he wanted the queen to be. Well, one of those was a young Jewish girl, Esther, who was being raised by her older cousin, who her parents died when she was young, and he raised her, and he's like a father to her. He's Mordecai. And so she was one of those the king brought before her, and guess what? That's who the king wanted. Now, Mordecai told her at that point, don't reveal that you're Jewish, because God put it on their hearts. Something's going to happen later on, so they just thought, let's be careful and cautious about how we do this. But there came a day where a man named Haman, who hated Mordecai, because Mordecai wouldn't bow down to Haman, who was second to the king in command, and you were supposed to bow down to him, but Mordecai wouldn't bow down to someone other than God. And so Haman wanted Mordecai put to death. Oh, you need to read, it's only 10 chapters, just a few pages. Read this story. It's as good as any novel you'll read, and it's true. But Haman wanted Mordecai put to death, so Mordecai told Esther, you need to go to the king, because he had made an edict that Haman wanted to put all the Jews to death, and it was irreversible in their law. So he said, you need to go and ask him to reverse this law in some manner, but our people will be destroyed. Well, Esther couldn't even go into the king unless he asked for her to come before him, and if she went and he didn't want to see her, he could have her put to death. So she was trying to tell that to Mordecai. I don't know. It's going to take some help for me to go in the right circumstance. And so her cousin Mordecai said, if you hold your peace at this time, then there will be an enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house shall be destroyed. And yet who knows whether you're come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Well, that's exactly why Esther was in that situation and at that time. So what did she do? She then said, tell Mordecai this answer. Gather together all the Jews and have them fast for me and not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. And my maidens will do likewise. And so she said, if I perish, I perish. And so Mordecai went his way, and the same thing happened with the queen. Well, it's interesting the way the process goes out. She went before the king. He wanted to see her. He even said, what is your request, even to half the kingdom? He was so pleased with her. And she did it in a very unique way, but eventually she said that Haman wanted the Jews to be put to death who were her people, and that they needed to be able to defend themselves. The king made an edict that they could, and they defended themselves. And even though Haman had built gallows to hang Mordecai on, they became the own gallows on which Haman lost his life and everything. Let me just give you some principles from this great book of the Bible for such a time as this. First of all, God's timing is impeccable. God does not always do things on time according to when we want it. There's a great song, gospel song, 4 days late. When he's 4 days late, he's still on time. And it talks about when Lazarus died. And Jesus got the word his close friend Lazarus was sick. And he was very close to Lazarus and his sisters, Mary and Martha. But he tarried, and he didn't go immediately. And he waited 4 days, and when he got there 4 days, Lazarus had already been dead. And even though Mary and Martha both believed that, Lord, if you'd come earlier, he'd be alive, guess what? Jesus was right on time, because even though Lazarus had been dead 4 days, Jesus raised him from the dead. You know, God doesn't always do things according to when we want to do it. Now, that doesn't mean that we should always just pray and watch, and we ought to be about the normal things a Christian should be doing, but we ought to be anticipating for God to work on our behalf. I write in my book, Divine Disciplines, about divine delay. That's when God tells you he's going to do something, and there's a period between when he tells you this and when it may happen way out. But in that period between when God tells it to you and it happens, that's where great men and women of God are molded and strengthened in their faith. And so that's what happens here. This was a divine delay, that they were going to be the deliverance for the Jews, but they didn't even know the Jews were going to need to be delivered up until Haman turned on them. So God's timing is impeccable. Secondly, God orchestrates circumstances sometimes way ahead of time, just for the right time when they can really make a difference in a greater way. You see, when Esther and Mordecai first became the queen and all this began to come about, at that time there wasn't someone out to get rid of the Jewish people that they were. But God orchestrated some things, which we'll get to in just a moment, that at just the right time it happened. You see, God placed Esther on the throne before she and her fellow Jews ever face complete destruction. Now, a good strategy when something like this occurs is to keep quiet until you've earned the right to be heard. Esther didn't immediately run and tell the king what was going on. She didn't reveal that she was Jewish at that point. She waited till there was a better opportunity. She knew the king loved her. He wouldn't want her to be killed or destroyed, and he would have protected her people. But that wasn't all known when all this began to take place at the beginning. And so, just keep quiet as much as possible. When Nehemiah was able to he was the cupbearer to his king, and he was able to go to Jerusalem to help build the wall of Jerusalem back up. There were those who didn't want the Jews to do that because they didn't want them back in power, and they were going to try to keep them from doing it. So Nehemiah at first toured the entire city to see what would be done. He didn't even tell people what he was doing or why he was there until it was just the right moment. So God will orchestrate circumstances sometimes way ahead of time for just the right time when they can really make a difference in someone's life. Thirdly, God will bring to someone's remembrance something that happened years ago that will apply in a remarkable way for the present moment. I didn't read the part in here, but at one time Mordecai became aware of a plot that two had to kill the king. So he got word to Esther, who then got word to the king, and it saved the king's life. Yeah, those other men put to death. But years later, there was a night after Haman had gotten the decree where he could kill the Jews at a certain date, and Mordecai then became aware of it, and Esther. And there happened to be a night where the king couldn't sleep. I call it divine insomnia. Maybe you've had divine insomnia at your night where you couldn't sleep and you kind of lay there awake. I tell you, start praying. Some people told me they can't pray, they fall asleep. Well, try praying when you can't sleep. But the king said, find the record book of things that have been done on behalf of the king. And he had forgotten about this, what had happened, and went back and found out that Mordecai had saved his life. So then he goes about and he decides, well, what should be done for a man who saved the king's life? And folks, the divine irony of it is something else. God can change everything about your life in a positive way instantly. What a difference a day can make. Things can be terrible, but as bad things can happen in a moment, the good things can happen too. And so when the king knew what was what had been done by Mordecai, he asked Haman, what should be done for a man who honors the king and so on? And Haman thought that the king was going to honor him. And then he found out, he said, I want to do that for Mordecai. Can you imagine that? Ham hated Mordecai, and Mordecai didn't care for Haman. So Haman then has to parade Mordecai around the town, and it was just humiliating. Again, he ended up losing his life. Mordecai became the second in command the whole land because the king allowed the Jews to defend themselves, and God gave them the victory. And you know what? Another person, sometimes even with us, what others mean for evil, God means for good. That's what happened with Joseph. His brothers sold him into bondage, but years later, Joseph was their deliverer because God had made him over the land of Egypt, and during the famine, he was able to take care of his people and all, and his own brothers had to come and beg for his mercy to be fed, but he took care of them. And he said, what they meant for evil, God meant for good. Sometimes when you don't understand situations happening in your life, just remember that. And it turned out quite to the contrary for Mordecai and Esther, the Jewish people. The Jews rested from their enemies, it says in Esther 9:22, and their sorrow was turned into joy and their mourning into happiness. That last chapter or two of Esther is a great book to read because it ties in so well with how I close this program out every week, because it talks about the joy that was in the lives of the Jewish people because of the victory that God had provided for them. And you see, friends, that's what God will do for us. And I pray you'll be able to say with me as I close this program out, thanks be to you, O God, who gives us the victory through our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ.